You've been taught to believe that power flows from money, that history is written by those who own, that the future belongs to those who can afford it. This is the great illusion of our age. Wealth presents itself as destiny, capital disguises itself as intelligence, and domination pretends to be natural order. But look closer, and the lie collapses. Every factory, every road, every machine, every city, every digital system that governs modern life is not the product of wealth, it is the product of labor. The future has never been bought. It has always been built by those who work. Society is divided not by talent or virtue, but by class. On one side stand those who own the means of production, on the other, those who possess nothing but their capacity to labor. This division is not accidental. It is the foundation upon which capitalism rests. The worker produces wealth, yet does not own it. The worker creates value, yet receives only a fraction of it. The remainder is seized, accumulated, and transformed into power by those who contribute nothing but ownership itself. This is exploitation, not as a moral insult, but as an economic fact. Capitalism praises freedom while organizing life around compulsion. You are told you are free, yet you must sell your labor to survive. You are told the market is neutral, yet it is structured to reward ownership and punish necessity. You are told competition is natural, yet it is deliberately cultivated to isolate workers from one another, to prevent solidarity from becoming strength. The system does not merely exploit labor, it disciplines it, fragments it, and trains it to accept its own subordination as common sense. Technology, which could liberate humanity from toil, is instead weaponized to deepen control. Machines do not free the worker. They intensify surveillance, accelerate production, and render labor more disposable. Efficiency increases, profits soar, yet insecurity spreads. The contradiction grows sharper. Society has never been more capable of abundance, yet deprivation persists. This is not failure of production, but failure of social relations. The problem is not that we cannot produce enough, it is that what we produce is organized for profit, not for human need. Capital presents itself as eternal, but it is historically specific. It was born from struggle, sustained by force, and it will end through collective action. Every right workers possess was won against resistance. The 8-hour day, the weekend, the right to organize none were gifts. They were concessions wrested from power by organized struggle. History moves not through the generosity of the ruling class, but through the pressure applied by the oppressed. Yet the greatest strength of the working class is also what the system most aggressively suppresses: unity. Workers are divided by nationality, race, gender, religion, and contract status, while capital moves freely across borders and industries. This division is not cultural accident, it is political strategy. As long as workers see one another as rivals, capital remains secure. The moment workers recognize themselves as a class with shared interests, the foundations of exploitation begin to crack. Class consciousness is not hatred, it is clarity. It is the understanding that individual struggle cannot solve systemic exploitation. No amount of personal discipline can overcome a structure designed to extract surplus value. No isolated success story negates the reality of mass dispossession. The worker does not need charity or motivation speeches, the worker needs power. And power is collective, organized, and directed toward transforming the relations of production themselves. The future will not be delivered by markets, nor granted by elites, nor inherited through speculation. It will be constructed through conscious human action. A society organized around human need rather than private profit is not a utopia, it is a rational response to an irrational system. When production is social, ownership must become social. When labor is collective, wealth must be collective. This is not the destruction of freedom, but its realization. Let the ruling class tremble at the possibility of a united working class. They know what history teaches, that no system survives once the masses withdraw their consent and assert their power. Workers of all industries, all identities, all nations, recognize yourselves not as competitors, but as comrades. Organize not for crumbs, but for control. Do not ask for a future to be sold to you. Build it with your own hands, for it is not capital that moves history forward. It is labor, conscious of itself, united in purpose, and determined to reclaim the world it has always created. Labor is the source of all wealth, yet in the society structured under capitalism. This truth is consistently obscured by the appearance of natural hierarchy and meritocracy. Every commodity, every service, every structure that sustains life in the modern world is the product of human effort, of skill and time invested by workers whose labor generates the value that accumulates into profit. The worker turns raw materials into products, transforms energy into production, molds knowledge into innovation, and organizes society's material needs into forms of exchange. Yet the wealth that emerges from this labor is never theirs to claim fully. Instead, it is systematically appropriated by those who own the means of production, those who contribute nothing more than property and legal privilege to the process. This appropriation is not incidental or accidental. It is the fundamental mechanism of capitalist society, embedded in law, reinforced by ideology, and enforced by economic and sometimes physical coercion. The worker may labor for hours, day after day, creating value beyond what they receive in wages, while the capitalist extracts the surplus produced, transforming labor into profit, profit into power, and power into the illusion of natural superiority. In this system, the more productive the worker, the more the capitalist benefits, creating a perverse incentive structure that rewards exploitation and punishes the laborer for their very efficiency. The paradox of labor under capitalism is profound. Society's material wealth depends entirely on work, yet work is systematically devalued in terms of compensation, respect, and control. The worker is taught to internalize this inequality as inevitable, to measure their worth in the currency of wages rather than in the intrinsic value of the contribution they make to society. Education, propaganda, and cultural narratives reinforce the notion that wealth is the product of individual genius or risk, rather than collective effort, obscuring the fact that every enterprise, every innovation, every economic achievement rests upon the labor of countless hands, minds, and bodies. Even when workers are formally recognized as skilled or essential, this recognition is often symbolic rather than material, serving to maintain morale while the underlying extraction continues. Capitalism, in this sense, functions by masking the reality of exploitation through the rhetoric of opportunity, merit, and mobility, creating the illusion that wealth and social position are rewards for personal excellence rather than the outcome of systematic appropriation. This illusion is perpetuated across generations, normalizing a structure in which those who labor have limited access to the very wealth they produce, while ownership remains concentrated in the hands of a few. The machinery of this exploitation is not limited to physical labor. Intellectual and creative work is similarly commodified, with authors, artists, and researchers often generating vast value for institutions or corporations, while receiving compensation far below the social worth of their contributions. The systemic nature of this extraction means that individual talent or exceptional effort rarely disrupts the fundamental imbalance. The rules of the system are designed to privilege ownership over production, accumulation over distribution, and profit over the dignity and autonomy of the worker. The capitalist structure also enforces a psychological dimension of exploitation. Workers are made to compete against each other, to internalize responsibility for outcomes shaped by force beyond their control, and to accept scarcity as natural rather than as the product of socially organized inequality. This competition fragments the working class, discourages solidarity, and obscures the reality that the wealth of society is built collectively. When the labor of the masses is appropriated as surplus value, it sustains a minority in luxury while the majority labors under conditions determined by others. The economic system transforms necessity into obligation and survival into labor, binding individual to production in a way that serves the accumulation of capital rather than the fulfillment of human needs. Labor, which should be the means by which humans shape their environment and realize their capacities, is instead subordinated to the imperatives of profit, reduced to a commodity in itself, bought at the lowest price the market allows. Wages represent not the value produced but the cost of subsistence, while the wealth generated above this level flows into the hands of those who do not participate in its creation. The systematic nature of this exploitation is reinforced by legal frameworks, social norms, and political institutions that protect property rights above human rights, corporate interests above collective welfare, and ownership above contribution. Every factory, office, farm, and institution under capitalism illustrates this pattern. The workers' labour creates the very material and social conditions from which others draw unearned gain, highlighting the profound moral and economic contradiction at the heart of the system. The extraction of surplus value is thus both an economic fact and a structural necessity of capitalism, ensuring that the creation of wealth is inseparable from the subordination of those who create it. Exploitation is not an occasional injustice, but the condition of production itself, a mechanism so deeply embedded that the worker's dependence on wages masks the relationship between labour and power. The more society relies on the collective work of the masses, the more opportunity arises for capital to seize the value generated, perpetuating inequality and securing the dominance of those who own the means of production. Every innovation, every increase in productivity, every advance in technology, instead of liberating labour under capitalism, often serves to intensify extraction, to discipline work more efficiently, to expand profit while leaving the labourer constrained and dependent. Labour is the engine of society, yet it is systematically appropriated, undervalued and constrained, producing a wealth that the workers themselves cannot fully enjoy, a wealth that underscores the injustice at the core of the economic system and demands a recognition that control over production, not just participation in it, is the only path toward genuine equity and human flourishing. Capitalism does not merely exploit labour, it requires division as a condition of its survival. The system is not satisfied with extracting surplus value from workers. It must also prevent them from recognizing the source of their own oppression. Division is cultivated deliberately, not by accident, and it takes many forms: economic, social, racial, ethnic, and gendered. Workers are taught to see one another as competitors rather than comrades, to identify with their wage rather than their class, to aspire to individual advancement rather than collective liberation. This isolation is the cornerstone of capitalist control because a united working class poses an existential threat to the accumulation of wealth and the power of those who own the means of production. By fragmenting labour, by ensuring that workers distrust one another, or compete for the smallest scraps of advantage, capitalism maintains the illusion that inequality is natural, that scarcity is inevitable, and that authority is deserved. This division is reflected in the structure of employment itself. Workers are pitted against each other in hierarchical organizations where promotion is limited, where contract terms vary, and where temporary or precarious work breeds insecurity. The threat of unemployment is wielded as a tool to discipline workers, make them fear that solidarity might endanger their individual survival. In the mind of the worker, competition is normalized as a moral principle rather than recognized as a mechanism of domination. Division extends beyond the workplace into the ideological sphere, where culture, media, and education reinforce hierarchies and distinctions between groups. The worker is encouraged to see the other as a rival, immigrants, racial or ethnic minorities, women, or those in different industries. Capital benefits from these divisions because are distracted, suspicious, and isolated. Working class is incapable of organizing effectively against systemic exploitation. The power of collective action strikes, protests, unions, and political mobilization is neutralized when workers perceive each other as threats rather than allies. Even when material interests align, perceived cultural, social, or regional differences are invoked to prevent unified resistance. Competition and rivalry are fetishized as personal virtues, while cooperation is portrayed as naive or impossible. This ideological apparatus trains workers to internalize hierarchy as natural, to accept inequality as inevitable, and to attribute their suffering to personal failure rather than systemic exploitation. Capitalism's division is reinforced through structural inequality. Wages differ not because of intrinsic skill alone, but because employers strategically fragment labor to create dependence and rivalry. Some workers are afforded benefits, stability, or higher pay, while others are marginalized, contingent, or excluded, fostering resentment and envy rather than shared solidarity. These distinctions prevent workers from seeing themselves as part of a collective whose combined labor produces all wealth, obscuring the fact that the division between rich and poor is neither inevitable nor justified, but manufactured and maintained by the capitalist system itself. Education and ideology serve to deepen the fragmentation. Workers are trained to aspire to the status of the owning class, to imagine upward mobility as possible for a few while accepting the immobility of the majority. Meritocracy is preached as a moral law, masking the structural conditions that produce inequality. Social narratives celebrate competition, reward individual achievement, and valorize self-interest, ensuring that solidarity is rarely seen as a rational or achievable path. Labor unions, cooperatives, and political organizations that attempt to unify workers are met with resistance. From capital, which employs legal, economic, and sometimes violent measures to prevent collective organization. This resistance is justified through rhetoric about efficiency, legality, and fairness, masking the underlying fear of unified worker power. Division also manifests in spatial and geographical terms. Global capitalism relocates production across borders to exploit differences in wages and labor rights, setting one group of workers against another. Nationalism, xenophobia, and protectionist sentiment are cultivated as tools to prevent workers in different regions or countries from recognizing their shared interests. Global inequality is normalized, presented as the natural order rather than the product of deliberate capitalist strategy. The result of these divisions is a working class that is dispersed, distracted, and unable to mount coherent resistance. The collective labor that produces society's wealth is fragmented into isolated individuals, competing factions, and rival identities. While the capitalist class consolidates ownership and decision-making, every technological innovation, every organizational restructuring, every policy designed to enhance productivity also serves to reinforce these divisions, ensuring that workers remain disunited, even as their labor becomes more essential to the system. The ideological and material forces of division are mutually reinforcing as workers internalize competition, as they fear losing their jobs, as they mistrust neighbors and colleagues. Their capacity for solidarity diminishes. Capitalism thrives on this fragmentation because unified labor represents the possibility of systemic change, the potential to challenge ownership, redistribute wealth, and reclaim collective control over production. Yet division is not natural, and it is not permanent. The very conditions of labor under capitalism's shared exploitation, common deprivation, collective creation of wealth provide the material basis for unity. If workers recognize their shared interests, if they overcome ideological and structural barriers, the system's foundation of division can be dismantled. History shows that workers, when organized and conscious of their collective power, can challenge exploitation, resist oppression, and reshape social relations. The capitalist reliance on division is therefore both a vulnerability and an indication of its dependence on isolation for survival. By understanding the mechanisms through which division is maintained, competition, hierarchy, ideological manipulation, spatial and contractual disparities, social prejudice, the working class can begin to forge solidarity. True power resides not in the isolated laborer, but in the united laboring class, capable of collective action, capable of transforming the social order, capable of reclaiming the wealth and future that has been systematically denied to them. Under capitalism, technological progress is often presented as a force for liberation, a means by which human labor is lightened and life is enriched. Yet the reality is far more insidious. Technology does not exist in a vacuum. It is developed, deployed, and directed within a system that prioritizes profit over human need, control over autonomy, and efficiency over dignity. The machines, algorithms, and infrastructures that promise freedom in theory are transformed under capitalist relations into instruments of discipline, surveillance, and exploitation. Every innovation is subordinated to the logic of accumulation. It must increase productivity, reduce labor costs, and maximize surplus value for the owners of capital. What could have liberated humanity instead reinforces subordination, reshaping labor and social life to the benefit of the few and the subjection of the many. Consider the factory. Automation and mechanization might reduce physical strain, but under capitalism they also intensify monitoring, increase output expectations, and render labor more fragmented and controllable. The worker is measured, timed, and evaluated against the demands of production, while the surplus generated by mechanized efficiency flows to the capitalist. The same machinery that could liberate time for creativity and rest instead extends control over the pace, quantity, and quality of labor. Surveillance technologies illustrate this logic vividly. Cameras, sensors, and data tracking systems are not neutral tools. They are deployed to ensure discipline, monitor productivity, and preempt dissent. The promise of technological empowerment is twisted into a mechanism for constant oversight, where the autonomy of workers is eroded and their activity becomes measurable, predictable, and manipulable. Algorithms organize schedules, assess performance, and even determine compensation, all in ways that reinforce the hierarchical control of the employer over labor. In the digital economy, technology creates new forms of dependency. Platforms extract labor under the guise of flexibility, gamifying work to maintain engagement while workers remain isolated, their efforts monetized for the benefit of platform owners. Remote work, automation, and AI might seem liberating, yet they increase precarity, blur boundaries between labor and life, and deepen surveillance. Productivity increases, but the worker's freedom is curtailed, traded for the illusion of convenience. Innovation under capitalism also exacerbates inequality. Technological advances concentrate wealth and power in the hands of those who control the means of production. Ownership of intellectual property, patents, and platforms allows capitalists to reap immense profits from labor. They neither perform nor manage directly, while those who generate the underlying value remain precarious, marginalized, or exploited. The social benefits of technology are distributed according to the logic of accumulation, not need, reinforcing existing hierarchies rather than dismantling them. Capitalist technology often reduces human creativity to inputs in a system of efficiency. Workers' tasks are segmented, routinized, and simplified to optimize output, turning knowledge and skill into standardized, quantifiable performance. Machines and algorithms replace judgment, skill, and autonomy with repetition and control, shaping behavior and expectation to fit the requirements of profit rather than human potential. Even scientific and technical knowledge is commodified, constrained by intellectual property, regimes, market pressures, and corporate funding, ensuring that innovation serves capital rather than society. The rhetoric of technological liberation obscures the social relations embedded in production. Automation is lauded as progress, yet it frequently increases job insecurity, intensifies exploitation, and justifies wage suppression. Artificial intelligence promises decision-making power, yet it is deployed to monitor workers, automate tasks, and consolidate managerial authority. The same tools that could democratize knowledge and labor are instead used to standardize behavior, optimize extraction, and maintain the dominance of those who own the infrastructure of production. Transportation, communication, and logistics systems, while seemingly connecting the world, are organized to maximize efficiency for capital. Global supply chains centralize control, enforce hierarchical coordination, and discipline labor across borders. Workers in distant factories, warehouses, and offices are linked not by solidarity but by surveillance. Productivity metrics, demonstrating how technological networks under capitalism extend control rather than empower individuals. Capitalism transforms the social and temporal dimensions of life through technology. Time, which could be reclaimed for creativity, learning, or rest, is instead structured to fit production schedules, deadlines, and efficiency imperatives. Attention, energy, and labor are commodified and measured, with technology acting as both instrument and enforcer of these demands. Rather than liberating human potential, technology under capitalism amplifies subjugation, embedding labor in systems designed to extract maximum value while minimizing autonomy. Even in leisure and communication, technology reflects capitalist imperatives. Social media, entertainment platforms, and digital economies monitor engagement, structure attention, and direct desire in ways that serve corporate profit. The illusion of freedom choice of platform, app, or product masks the deeper constraints imposed by ownership, monetization, and algorithmic control. The worker's time, creativity, and attention are harvested, turning potential freedom into a resource for capital accumulation. Technological progress, therefore, under capitalism does not equate to emancipation. It intensifies the organization of production and control over labor, expands the capacity of capital to extract surplus value, and deepens the dependence of the working class on structures they do not own. The promise of liberation is subordinated to profit imperatives, and every innovation, instead of expanding human autonomy, expands the capacity of capital to govern, discipline, and exploit. Labor becomes more measurable, more fragmentable, more surveilled, and more vulnerable, while wealth, knowledge, and power concentrate in the hands of a few. The contradiction between the potential of technology and its capitalist application highlights the need for collective control over production, for the democratization of innovation, and for the alignment of technological progress with human needs rather than capitalist imperatives. Only through the conscious, organized action of the working class can the tools of production and knowledge be repurposed to liberate rather than dominate, to expand freedom rather than consolidate control, to serve human flourishing rather than the accumulation of private wealth. Class consciousness is the foundation upon which the possibility of emancipation rests. It is the recognition by workers that their individual struggles are not isolated incidents, but expressions of a shared condition created and maintained by the structures of capitalism. Without this awareness, labor remains fragmented, easily manipulated, and perpetually subjected to the demands of those who control the means of production. The capitalist system thrives on obscuring the relationship between the laborer and the wealth they produce, teaching workers to internalize blame for their own exploitation, to see scarcity and hierarchy as natural, and to pursue personal advancement rather than collective liberation. Class consciousness shatters these illusions by revealing that the source of oppression is not individual weakness or lack of talent, but a systemic imbalance in the organization of society itself. It allows workers to identify their shared interests, understand the mechanisms through which surplus value is extracted, and recognize the social and economic conditions that bind them into subjugation. Awareness alone, however, is insufficient without action. Consciousness must translate into organized solidarity, the deliberate unification of workers across industries, regions, and identities to challenge the structures that enforce inequality. Capitalism deliberately fosters division, exploiting differences of nationality, ethnicity, gender, and status to prevent the formation of a united working class. Ideologies of competition, meritocracy, and individual responsibility obscure the commonality of workers' interests and encourage mistrust between those whose labor collectively sustains society. Solidarity counters this by cultivating a sense of shared purpose and mutual obligation, transforming isolated grievances into a coherent struggle against exploitation. History demonstrates that every advance in workers' rights, from the 8-hour day to the abolition of child labour, from the right to unionize to protections against arbitrary dismissal, has been achieved through collective action, through organized solidarity that translates shared awareness into social power. The strength of the working class is not in the labor of one, but in the labor of many coordinated toward a common objective. Strikes, protests, unions, cooperatives, and revolutionary movements exemplify the capacity of organized workers to assert control over the conditions of their labor and the distribution of its fruits. Collective action disrupts the normal functioning of capitalist accumulation by withdrawing the cooperation upon which it depends, demonstrating that power resides not with the owners of capital, but with those who produce wealth. Class consciousness also entails critical understanding of the ideological apparatuses that maintain capitalism, including media, education, and political institutions. These systems shape perception, normalize inequality, and channel dissent into forms that do not threaten the status quo. Solidarity strengthens the capacity of workers to resist these ideological constraints by fostering dialogue, mutual education, and shared strategy, creating a space in which the collective perspective can challenge and eventually dismantle the narratives that sustain exploitation. Emancipation is not merely the removal of external oppression. It is the transformation of social relations themselves, so that labor ceases to be a commodity and becomes a conscious, self-directed activity that fulfills human needs rather than generating profit for an elite minority. Organized solidarity allows workers to assert democratic control over production, distribution, and the social conditions of life, ensuring that the collective labor of society benefits all rather than enriching a few. Without solidarity, individual resistance is isolated and easily neutralized, but when workers act together, they exercise power that capital cannot ignore or easily suppress. Furthermore, solidarity amplifies the voices of the marginalized within the working class, bridging divisions imposed by the capitalist order and ensuring that emancipation is inclusive rather than partial. It teaches that liberation is inseparable from the collective struggle, that individual success cannot substitute for structural change, and that social justice is realized through mutual empowerment. Class consciousness and solidarity also provide the framework for long-term strategic planning, allowing workers to anticipate and respond to the countermeasures of capital. By understanding the systemic nature of exploitation, the working class can organize not only for immediate material gains, but for the transformation of society itself, creating institutions, norms, and practices that prioritize human need, dignity, and participation over profit. In recognizing shared interests and acting in concert, workers reclaim agency over their lives, transforming labor from a site of subjugation into a source of empowerment. Consciousness informs strategy, solidarity enables action, and together they constitute the precondition for the revolutionary reorganization of society. Without awareness of one's class position, the mechanisms of exploitation remain invisible, and the capacity for coordinated struggle is stunted. Without solidarity, consciousness remains abstract, incapable of exerting real influence on the structures that govern labor and wealth. The combination of insight and collective action, of understanding and organization, is the essence of emancipation. Through class consciousness, workers grasp the systemic roots of their oppression, and through organized solidarity, they acquire the capacity to dismantle those structures. Knowledge and unity converge to create power, transforming labor from a source of exploitation into the means by which society can be collectively and democratically shaped. It is this intersection of awareness and organization that challenges the foundations of capitalist authority, undermines the legitimacy of accumulated wealth, obtained through coercion, and establishes the possibility of a society in which human needs, creativity and dignity are prioritized over profit and hierarchy. The future is not something that can be purchased or inherited. It is constructed through the labor, effort and vision of those who create society's wealth. Every road, every building, every system of communication, every product of daily life, and every innovation that sustains civilization is the result of collective human labor. Capital does not generate these things on its own. It merely claims ownership of what labor produces. The illusion that wealth can buy progress obscures a fundamental truth. The material and social foundations of the world are built by the working class. In capitalism, those who perform the work, the builders, the farmers, the teachers, the engineers, the health workers, the service laborers, are systematically denied ownership of the results of their efforts. Profit, accumulation, and the accumulation of power are concentrated in the hands of those who own the means of production, while the laborers whose efforts create value are left dependent on wages, precarious employment and marginal influence over the decisions that shape their lives. This extraction is not accidental. It is structurally embedded in the economic system. Capital does not create value, it captures it. It transforms the collective efforts of workers into private wealth, and in doing so, it pretends to control the future. The truth is that the future belongs to those who act, to those who labor, to those who organize, and to those who envision a society structured around human need rather than private accumulation. When workers act collectively, they reclaim the power to shape their own lives and the society in which they live. Strikes, unions, cooperatives, and movements are not merely tactics, they are demonstrations of the principle that collective action is the engine of progress. Every historical advance that benefits labor, shorter working hours, social protections, political representation, and access to education was won not through the generosity of capital, but through the organized power of those who labor. The capacity to build the future is inherent in the working class, because they are the producers of all material and social wealth. Ownership and control, when concentrated in the hands of the few, may dictate terms temporarily, but they cannot create the wealth without the labor that is systematically subordinated to profit. To understand this is to recognize the necessity of unity. The more workers organize across industries, regions, and identities, the more they can assert influence over the direction of society. Fragmentation and competition are tools of the capitalist system designed to isolate workers and prevent them from recognizing their shared stake in shaping the future. The moment labor acts collectively, the power of capital is revealed as contingent rather than absolute, and the claim that wealth alone can dictate outcomes is exposed as an ideological fiction. The building of the future is inseparable from the control over production and distribution. A society that allows capital to determine what is produced, who produces it, and who benefits from it, is a society in which the future is bought rather than built. In contrast, a society in which workers collectively decide what is necessary, how to organize production, and how to distribute the fruits of labor is a society in which the future belongs to humanity rather than to private owners. Every technological innovation, every industrial development, every cultural achievement is made possible by collective effort. When capital takes credit for these achievements, it conceals the labor that underlies them, creating the illusion that the owners of property are the architects of society. Yet the reality is that without the skills, knowledge, and cooperation of workers, capital could produce nothing. The future, therefore, is inseparable from the conscious action of the working class. To be passive, to wait for wealth to trickle down, or to believe that capital will benevolently allocate progress is to surrender agency. Real progress emerges only when those who labor unite, deliberate, and act to shape social structures according to human priorities rather than profit motives. Political organization, education, and mutual solidarity are, essential instruments in this process. By understanding their collective power, workers can intervene in the allocation of resources, the design of production, and the shaping of society's institutions. This is the principle that distinguishes a society built by its people from one that is merely managed by owners of wealth. Capital may attempt to buy influence through lobbying, ownership, or market manipulation, but these transactions cannot replace the labor that generates real wealth. When workers recognize this truth, they reclaim the authority to direct society's trajectory. Every strike, every cooperative, every political movement, every act of mutual aid is a step toward demonstrating that the future is constructed through collective effort rather than purchased influence. Education and consciousness raising are critical because they enable workers to see the systemic mechanisms that transfer wealth upward and deny agency downward. Understanding the exploitation inherent in capitalism is not an abstract exercise, it is a prerequisite for collective action, because only by grasping the power of labor as the source of all wealth can the working class effectively assert control over the creation and distribution of society's resources. The process of building the future is thus both material and social. Material because it relies on the labor that produces goods, infrastructure, and services. Social because it requires organization, solidarity, and shared vision. Capital may claim ownership of the machinery, the factories, or the financial instruments, but without the cooperative effort of workers, these tools are inert. Collective labor transforms resources into civilization, shaping not only the material conditions of life, but the social, cultural, and political structures that define the world. To recognize this is to recognize the agency of those who produce. The future is not a commodity to be purchased, but a realm to be built through collective will, planning, and action, where human need and ingenuity take precedence over private accumulation, and where the laboring majority asserts its rightful role as the architects of what is to come. The future is not a gift to be purchased, nor a privilege reserved for those who hoard wealth. It is the product of human labor, the conscious, collective effort of those who build society with their hands, minds, and creativity. Capitalism seeks to obscure this truth by dividing workers, appropriating their labor, and presenting accumulation as destiny. Yet the power of the working class is undeniable. Every structure, every innovation, every advancement in society is born from their effort. Liberation is not granted by the owners of capital. It is claimed by those who recognize their shared strength, organize in solidarity, and act to transform the conditions of production and distribution. Class consciousness illuminates the mechanisms of exploitation, while collective action translates awareness into power. Through unity, education, and deliberate struggle, the laboring majority can reclaim ownership not just of wealth but of the society it sustains. The future belongs not to those who purchase it, but to those who build it together, shaping a world where human need, creativity, and dignity guide production rather than profit, and where emancipation is realized through the organized, conscious, and unstoppable force of the working class.